The last spell leaves early access tomorrow, so let's dive into the 1.0 patch notes right now. So the first thing that we are going to be talking about is the new map that they teased in the developer blog. That is Glintfine, and this is some concept art for it that basically shows the entire town sinking into some type of void, maybe when we have defeated the fog and channeled the last spell, hard to say, but the actual in-game screenshot that they share with us shows an incredibly desolate final map. They hint at the fact that we will have more gold and resources to spend, so likely this is going to be a very free-form experience. We're going to be able to build up the specific things that we think we need and we want. The other thing that I think it's worth drawing your attention to is the center set of channeling mages includes one that looks a lot more like a hero, has an eye patch, appears to be a little older with gray hair, has some character. So presumably there's going to be some type of story to go along with that. They also shared this animated GIF of portions of the map phasing in and out. My suspicion here is that probably the map is going to change from night to night. They've already told us that Glintfine is going to be a sprint. It's only 7 nights long. And so as a result, it could be interesting if we saw each night have its own unique set of terrain that morphs as we kind of play through it. It could borrow from all of the different previous locations and then have some uniqueness towards the end. They also gave us a small hint at what the boss mechanic was going to include, showing us this glowing orb that we might want to kill, we might want to run away from, we might want to run towards. We're going to have to wait and see, but they have certainly made it very clear that Glintfine is designed to be the hardest of the maps that we've encountered to date. There's also an overhaul of the tutorial. Ishtar has made it very clear that they understand that the last spell can be a daunting game. That's why I've been working on my beginner's guide series, which at this point needs a bit of an update because of how much is changing. But as a result, they've been working hard on making the tutorials more accessible in-game and more appearing at opportune moments. I won't go into all the details, but it looks like they're making some great strides there, and I'm excited to see what kind of information they're sharing with new players. The next big headlining feature is a new basic enemy, which is really exciting. This enemy presumably is going to show up on all of the maps, and it is an enemy designed to tutorialize one of the primary stats that the game has, specifically resistance. So for those who are a little familiar with the game, we already have several armored units and dodgy units that kind of teach the player how those mechanics works. And now we have the Kindled, which is designed to explain how resistance works to the player. So it's going to have a very small health pool, but a very high resistance, which means that if you don't have some type of resistance reduction, be it using magic damage or the stat resistance reduction, you're going to have a very hard time taking it out. Also, just generally speaking, I think the art style on this one is really cool. They have this kind of like Nicolas Cage and Ghost Rider flaming skull type of thing going on. Very nice. Next up in their list is achievements. We will have a full complement of achievements to unlock as we play through the game in Steam, and it seems like they've tried to go light on the super hardcore quote-unquote achievements, which means I think we're going to be seeing a lot more of the kind of like standard complement of like beat Glenwald, beat Lateberg, beat them on Apocalypse 6, so on and so forth. But it sounds like there's going to be quite a breadth of them. It's going to be very interesting to see what they are. I'm excited to unlock them just because I like the game and I like a lot of the other progression systems that they've put in place. Moving on to balancing. I think this is probably the headline feature of 1.0. If you're looking for one thing that 1.0 is going to do to transform the game, it is a balancing pass over basically everything. The philosophy that they've taken, which I think is a smart but sometimes daunting one, is to basically say that a strategic game can only flourish if all of the options at your disposal are noteworthy. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to make every weapon, every piece of armor have a niche and have a place where it would be useful. I'm not sure that they are going to fully succeed in that goal, as some things will always outperform others, but it is very clear that they're taking this responsibility seriously, and 1.0 is a massive overhaul to balance, and we're going to be talking a lot about balance as we go. The first place where we're going to be spending a lot of time is the balancing of weapons. And they have rebalanced, it seems, every weapon in the game, and they have been collecting a lot of feedback and trying to make it so all of the weapons feel comparable in terms of power level. That means that we're going to be seeing nerfs to some of the strongest builds and then buffs to some of the other ones. That means that momentum and multi-hit are getting hit hard, as it were, and they will be buffing some other skills to try and balance that out. One of the ways that they seem to be doing this, and they kind of talk about this in paragraph 2 here, is that because each weapon has multiple skills, if they take one skill and obliterate it, blaze on the one-handed crossbow, they can buff up, say, the poison skill on the one-handed crossbow to try to balance that out. They've also completely overhauled the momentum system. We'll talk more about that in a second, but it seems like it's not going to be delivering the massive hits that it previously did. The other observation that they made was that buffs and debuffs felt a little bit weaker. And so one thing that they've done is they've really generously buffed those. So things like the weaken ability on the tome has seen a massive increase in potency, and they're trying to kind of round those out. I think they're going to have a hard time with that because I think damage is incredibly important in the last spell, but it's interesting to see them trying to do it, and we'll see some examples of that when we go through each weapon individually, because brace yourself, that is happening. Other balancing changes that they've made is that armor, offhand weapons, potions, and scrolls have had their stats radically adjusted, some of them completely re-envisioned. For instance, offhand weapons are now going to be borrowing the first ability off of their full counterparts, and scrolls and potions have some new scaling and new attributes associated with them. And then also omens and perks are getting some adjustments. Blood magic apparently got a massive overhaul, which we're going to have to explore in game, so I don't want to dive into it too much here, but there's definitely a lot to look at there. Next, we move on to quality of life adjustments. And the first one is that the attack information panel has gotten some nice addendums. You're now going to see how much you can potentially crit for. They've added some little widgets on the side to give you your resistance, the enemy's dodge. It seems like they're just cleaning this up a bit. I like what they're doing here. Any improvements to the attack information panel are going to be very welcome. Item comparisons. I'm really excited about this one, actually, because I don't think I fully appreciated what we were missing, but the basic concept here is that when you add a piece of equipment, you are changing your stats and you are changing the piece of equipment. And previously, it didn't really do the math to communicate that. So what you see here in the example is the left short bow has skill range and the right short bow has damage. And so now when you compare the two, you're actually going to be able to see the difference in damage that you're pumping out. I think this is an amazing quality of life. And I know that it was very complicated because there's a lot of like adding and subtracting stats that they had to do to get this right, but now it looks like it's going to be reliable, and I think that's going to be great for, especially for new players. Next up, we have the Perk Planner with a snazzy dagger animation. This is going to allow you to basically go into the perk portion of a character and say, this is my plan for how to play it out. They don't really show you exactly how it works. It kind of looks to me like you right click on the ones that you want to add, or maybe you just click on the ones that you want to add. My only concern here is that it doesn't look like it's keeping track of budget for you. So we'll talk about this a little bit more when we talk about other quality of life improvements, but the fundamental problem here may be that you have to remember how many perks you get at each level in order to be able to use this effectively. The next quality of life one is just better filtering and sorting in the Oracle column. I believe that's how it's pronounced. I've been trying. This is nice. I don't think this is going to be hugely valuable, but maybe a little bit useful. For the most part, I find that just scrolling through it is good enough when you're looking to unlock things. Next on the quality of life train is some improvements to mana wells and temples. I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but it seems like they improved some of the iconography. They added a few animations to make things look a little better and gave a bit of a preview as to where you can potentially spend an ability and where the ability is actually getting spent. So Very useful. I like that they're making changes here, but I don't think this one's going to be particularly impactful to gameplay as a general observation. The next one, though, is super fun. And for people who have watched me play the game a little bit, you know that I generally actually name my characters in a way that indicates what build I'm going for. And now this quality of life change adds the weapons that are equipped on a particular hero to the compare gear with dropdown, which means that at a glance, you have a much easier time knowing who's who, right? If I see a poison staff on one of my heroes, I know that they're probably the poison hero. And if I'm looking to equip a poison staff, it'll make it a lot easier to do comparisons. So that was the deep dive blog post that they did. Now we have to go into the patch notes, which is where things get nitty and they get gritty. But let's keep powering through because I'm burning the midnight oil over here. So for actual quality of life changes that are beyond the ones that were detailed in the blog post, they've completely overhauled the keybind system. So you have a lot more flexibility. I'm excited to see the way this works in game. Obviously, I can't check it out right now, but I'm hoping that we see a lot more ability to bind things to specific abilities like punch, right? Is punch going to be a key? Only time will tell. But the main thing that they note here is that because this is such a large overhaul, they are resetting everyone's keybinds. So expect your keybinds to be different when you enter into the last spell tomorrow. Perk points will now show max when you've reached the maximum number. Seems good. And then some dialogue and improving the speed at which you can enter and leave the Orichalcum. Both sound like very nice quality of life changes. Some refinements to the menu system. Also some adjustments to the way that tooltips works to clarify what's going on in various options in the menu. They added an option to manually force which type of device should be used for inputs. A lot of these things seem very nice in terms of quality of life. You can set up your HUD to show both the current and maximum values for movement, mana, HP, etc. Excuse me. Lots of little bits and pieces here and there. Next up on quality of life, we have the option to hide keyword explanation tooltips. I think this is going to be really nice, especially for players like me who play with the UI at max scale. It'll be nice not to have, say, contagion showing up every single time I mouse over. I know what that does. I don't need to see it all of the time. We'll have some options to display key bindings on the skill bar, ability to change the way that you pan the camera based on edge of screen, etc. Certain HUD adjustments. There's a lot of little things that I think we're going to only appreciate when we start delving into the game. Yeah, here's the camera edge panning that I was just talking about. Also, now when you mouse over a defensive building, you will get its range, which I think is going to be very helpful for understanding where your catapults can hit without having to click on them, go and look at them, so on and so forth. Construction limits are now going to have some additional coloring and highlighting depending. There will also be some changes to the right-click behavior on things, some streamlining of the recruitment process. The inn won't pop back up when you recruit a hero. And then the commander's journal, which is where all of your production items come in, is now apparently also going to share information about free building abilities and a few other things. But now into the actual exciting kind of gameplay modifications. And the first is the gutting of momentum. For those who don't know, momentum was by far and away the most hard-hitting set of abilities in the game. If you properly built a momentum hero, you were one-shotting bosses with it. You were walking up to Cresselia in Lakeburg and hitting her for 10,000 damage pretty consistently. This appears to no longer be the case, although it's hard to fully know. What they say here is that a momentum attack will at most deal 5 times more damage. This is unfortunately ambiguous language that we're going to have to experiment with, but what I think they probably mean is 5 times base damage of the weapon. which is not very much. Now, if it is 5 times base damage modified by your damage and your other damage scaling, I think you would still get some very large numbers out of it. But I don't have a good handle on how this is changing things. The other piece of the momentum nerf is that there will now be a new modifier called no momentum on certain things that will include warp gates and various perks that will no longer contribute to your momentum counting. So the idea is basically previously, however far you moved, that was how much your momentum would carry essentially, or be modified by. And now certain teleportation abilities are going to carry this no momentum modifier to stop the incredible long distances. But for context, things like the sword's dash ability will still contribute to momentum. The other big change here, or I don't know if it's a big change, we're going to have to wait and see, is stun. And what they say they've done is they basically modified stun so it can go above 100%. So what it looks like to me is that at some point in the calculation, the base stun chance of your weapon was added to your innate stun chance of your hero. And if those exceeded 100, it was rounded down to 100 or floored at 100. So now it should be a little easier to stun some of the really tough enemies. One of the things that's in the back of my mind is how this is going to work with contamination and contagion, which historically seemed to, I'll say, circumvent some of the stun chance calculations and may continue to, but only time will tell. The other note that they make here is that heroes, and only heroes, will also gain immunity to stun after they get stunned. So this is to avoid your heroes getting stun locked. Next up, we have some new bounds for attributes. It looks like max health has been increased to 1,000, and the minimum amount of mana has been increased to 8, and the minimum number of movement points has been increased to 3. I think all this really means is that you have a little more headroom when scaling hit points, and on average, you'll have a little more mana and a little more movement on new heroes. But I'm not entirely sure of that. This might also, although we're going to have to test it, only impact the fact that your hero's movement can never go below 3, but hard to say at this point. They also made some changes to some of the stats leveling up. Specifically, it looks like we're going to be getting more mana from mana level ups and slightly less mana regen from higher tier mana regen level ups. Resistance got a across the board buff, and momentum got an across the board nerf when it comes to leveling up your heroes. As for equipment, it looks like mana regen, and momentum have been rebalanced based on this. I assume that means we're going to see a little less momentum on pieces of equipment. We'll have to wait and see. Action points are going to be less prevalent on low-level items and significantly, or I guess only slightly more frequent on high-level items, which means you'll likely end runs with your heroes having more action points than they used to, but you're going to have a harder time getting that lucky early action point. And then multi-hit affixes, the random ones, will now only be on items of level 2 or more, with their frequency increasing by item level. This means it's going to be a lot harder to stack up to max multi-hit before the end of a run, right? You're not going to be on level 2 gear finding a lot of plus multi-hit, but it seems likely that as you start to get up to level 5 gear, you're going to have a lot of multi-hit available. As for traits, same thing. They've rebalanced mana and mana regen in accordance with the level ups. So I think that basically means that if you have a trait that reduces or increases your mana, it will now be slightly more than it was previously, while the mana regen will be slightly less. That's my suspicion. Next up, we got to talk about weapons, and this is going to be a big section of the video because there are a lot of weapon tweaks to talk about. But basically, the first thing that they say is that all native attribute bonuses to weapon variations have been tweaked. That's basically like Adamantium Spear came with one, I think, action point previously. It might not anymore. And they have tried to make those bonuses consistent with the weapon's skill set. So if the weapon is a stunning weapon, we'll probably see more stun types of options available to it. So first and foremost, we have the sword. And I think for the most part, the sword looks like a buff to me, if I had to guess. The general look of it is the momentum on slice has been increased. Dash has had its damage modifier increased, and Blade Rush has also had its damage modifier increased. But all of this is on the back of a base damage lowering. So as with all of these, it's going to be really hard to see until we actually get in there and play with it. But my suspicion would be that as long as you are kind of alternating your slices with your dashes, your momentum attacks are probably going to hit harder in the early game and then scale slightly worse into the late game, because that's the new design for momentum. The hammer has seen a small increase in its bottom end of its base damage, and then crush is now modifiable by hero skill range and comes with a higher damage modifier but a lower opportunism multiplier, which I think is going to hurt it as an opportunism weapon, unsurprisingly, but also maybe make it a little more viable as a standalone weapon. And then Stomp now has a slightly higher chance of stunning and will stun that middle enemy, which previously was not the case. Slightly ambiguous on the tooltip, but now it should behave like a 3x3 stun. The axe has lost inaccurate, which is super exciting because I think the axe was already very strong, and now it's going to be very, very strong. Also, Axe Boomerang is now a 7-tile AoE, up from a 5-tile AoE, with slightly better damage associated with it as well. We're going to have to see what the shape on this one is. I'm assuming rather than being a 5-tile U, it's going to be a longer U that extends back an additional tile. So it'll be like up, up, over, over, basically like a 3x3 with the 2 middle tiles missing, but we'll see how that works out. The dagger is getting a big change. So first of all, its base damage is increasing pretty substantially, probably the largest upgrade in terms of base damage we've seen so far. And that's going to come with backstab having less isolation multiplier. 25% is nothing to sneeze at, but it can be made up for pretty easily in stats. Perforate, which was a skill that I generally thought of as pretty worthless, is being completely replaced by Throwing Dagger, which is going to be a 1 AP ability you can use twice a turn with a 4 range, a 1.3x damage multiplier that cannot be blocked. Interesting. Gonna have to see how that plays out. And then that is being, and then Throwing Daggers, now that Throwing Daggers is the name of skill number 2, is being replaced by Poison Daggers, which has 4 multi-hit up from 3 that it previously had. Less average damage. Looks like we're taking like a 25 average damage hit, but we're recouping some of that in terms of damage on the poison, which is going from 25 to 30. I'm not sure this is going to work out, but I do like seeing more multi-hits on the dagger. I think it makes a poison build with daggers potentially more likely to be viable. You might be able to pair up a druid staff with a dagger, potentially. We'll have to wait and see. Next, we have two-handed swords. The two-handed swords thrust, which is a second skill, its momentum skill, is seeing a bit of a nerf kind of across the board, less momentum scaling, and then also less of a damage multiplier. And then charge is seeing its mana cost increased by 2. I am unsurprised to see this. I think charge was the only skill on the two-handed sword that I thought was a standout. So seeing it nerfed hurts a little bit, but I also totally understand because I think it was very strong. I think two-handed swords are in a bad place in this next patch, but maybe everything else is coming down to their level. We'll have to wait and see. The sledgehammer is getting a bit of a base damage nerf, and then a very interesting thing. I called this out in red because I think it's a little easy to miss otherwise, but both hammer strike and follow up now have a minimum range of 2. We're also seeing the stun chance reduced on Hammer Strike, which I think is fine. I think that's okay. Hammer Strike is a very powerful stun ability. And then Follow Up now has Opportunism on it, which I am super excited about because I think that the Sledgehammer Opportunism build was really strong and really fun, and having Follow Up have Opportunism means that you can pair it with Contamination and very quickly move around and get a lot more mobility. Mega Stomp, the Propagate ability on the two-handed hammer, is seeing its damage modifier increased ever so slightly and now comes with a 33% damage buff. And what's really interesting here is because this is a Propagate ability, if you get 2 big guys standing next to each other, you could fully debuff their damage, I think, pretty straightforwardly. And then Ground Smash, an ability that I do not think needed it at all, gets a small damage buff, so that's awfully nice. The Great Axe does not lose its inaccuracy. Inaccuracy is still a thing. It sees its base damage increase, though, and then it sees leaps damage increase significantly. That's a big 20% increase in damage. And the secondary effect has been changed from a resistance debuff into a movement debuff. I'm of 2 minds about this because I think they just introduced a resistance-based enemy, which would have made this leap skill useful for taking it out with melees when you don't have a magic user handy, but we'll have to wait and see. Maybe that will still be okay. And then Super Spin gets a minor 10% damage increase. I think they could have been more generous with this, and it would have been a-okay. But interestingly, the Great Axe's damage buff ability remains untouched. Next up, we have the Spear. The Spear is getting a moderate increase to its base damage and a small buff to Rush, its momentum ability that targets 2 enemies in front. And then Skewer, its big attack, is getting a, well, its multi-hit attack, not its big conical attack. That one's remaining the same, is getting a nice buff to damage and increase to the number of hits from multi-hit, but it's losing its armor penetration and it's adding no dodge. I think this is a net negative for the Spear's Skewer ability. I think that armor piercing was a nice thing for it to have, and the absence of that is going to be felt. No dodge interests me a lot less, I think. The Wand. I was shocked to not see Magic Missile getting any adjustments after all of the rigmarole on multi-hit previously. But the Wand is getting an increase to base damage, another one of the larger increases, and its first skill, Sword of Damocles, has no dodge associated with it, which is just a straight buff. I think that's going to make the Wand a little more valuable. And then Transfer is now going to have some scaling associated on level. At level 0, the Wand is going to give 2 movement. At level 5, it will give 4 movement. And added a caster effect of plus 10% damage for 1 turn, up to 15 at level 5. So I think what this means is, in addition to the Transfer, you will also be adding damage to the person who is targeted. It's a nice buff to Transfer. I'm not convinced that this makes the Wand viable outside of kind of Magic Missile spam, basically, but we'll have to wait and see. The Scepter's back. So the Scepter is in an interesting place because in a previous balance patch, it got nerfed into Oblivion. And now the uses per turn on Magic Bash, which is its primary attack with momentum, have been returned to their former glory of 5. It's been given a range of 3. We don't know if that's modifiable by skill range yet, but if it is, that's going to be very interesting to play around with. And perhaps most important, it has the highest momentum scaling in the game from the looks of it. Windwalk was given a skill range increase. That's the restore movement points ability. And Shocking Touch has been completely removed, which I think means that the Scepter is only going to have it will have its propagate ability, which has not been modified as far as I can tell. So it'll have 3 abilities only, and Magic Bash can now be used 5 times, which I think is a really nice adjustment. The Magic Orb, probably the least touched ability, only had some tweaks made to its uses per turn. Infect, which is its isolate attack, had it increased by 1, and Putrid Ball can be used 1 less time. I think the Magic Orb is in a good place in regard to this. The Power Staff, one of my surprise favorite weapons of the recent patches, now has its accuracy debuff scaling over time, starting at 10%, going up to 15%. Stunning Entrance has seen its mana cost decreased and also its stun chance decreased. And then Fire Thrower, its large conical attack, is now 1 less mana. I think the big standout here, the only thing that I think is of any real interest, is Stunning Entrance being 1 mana, I think is huge for Power Staff as a mobility weapon. I think Power Staff remains the core opportunism item in the game, from my perspective, and I think it is cementing its place there, with Stunning Entrance getting even better. Tome of Secrets gets a lot of changes. So first of all, base damage going up by a nice chunk. Weakening Touch, massive buff. I still don't know if it's enough that I'll ever use it. We now have it doing a 30% resistance debuff, a 30% damage debuff, and now it hits 6 targets. Maybe that makes it worth it. We'll have to wait and see. Fireball gets a nerf to its average damage, but is now armor piercing, which I think is very interesting. That's going to make it amazing for taking down things like spearmen, as an example. And then Lightning Strike gets a damage nerf, which I think makes sense because, from what I understand, some people have made very good effect of using lightning to just obliterate enemies. The Druid Staff. So we expected a nerf here, and we got a nerf. But to go through them, Fly Trap, which is the opportunism attack on the Druid Staff, gets a 4th use, which I think is big for the Druid Staff as a standalone single weapon. Acid Spray is now moved from skill number 4 to skill number 3. So they're basically switching the order of bees and acid spray. Excuse me. But acid spray is now going to only cost 1 AP. It's going to be usable twice per turn. And it is going to remove armor up to 300 at level 5 for 2 turns. The phrasing that they did in the patch notes on this one was very confusing, but I think that's what that roughly means. I think that right now it does -100 to -200. Now it does -100 to -300 in terms of its scaling. And then Bees is the big nerf. It is now going to be a 2 AP, 3 mana ability. I think it is still incredibly strong at that point, but it being on 2 mana previously was definitely a huge strength that it had. The Hand Crossbow. Rip Hand Crossbow. Maybe. We'll have to wait and see. It's definitely a shade of its former glory. The Hand Crossbow is getting a base damage buff, although still very modest. Quick Shot no longer snares. So the multi-hit attack that was the bread and butter of the Hand Crossbow no longer snares, and instead is armor piercing. I think that is going to make it strong against some armored units that don't have block, but it's still going to suffer a lot from any type of block that is reducing its damage. Slow Death had its snare increased, which does mean that you basically have -4 movement that you can put out per turn with the Hand Crossbow. Not a lot compared to before, when you could be snaring up 20 movement with full multi-hit. Weak Spot was removed completely, and then Blazed no longer has multi-hit on it. So it was the only skill in the game that had propagate and multi-hit, and that is gonzo. Blaze will now only cost 1 AP and 2 mana. Can be used 3 times per turn, and it has 4 propagate natively without the multi-hit. I don't know. Hand crossbow feels like it's going to be in a weird place. Maybe it's still strong enough, but it's definitely never going to be that run-defining, unbelievable skill. The pistol. So the pistol gets a very modest top-end damage drop on its base damage, and then pistol shot gets more momentum. Grappling shot gets more damage and isolation, which I think is a really cool way for them to take this. I think what it means is that if you are smart in your target selection, grappling shot will often be a kill and will build up your momentum for your next pistol shot. So I like the direction that they're pushing the pistol. And then grape shot just gets a 35% damage increase, which I think is going to make it a lot better at tearing down waves of enemies. So I like the changes to pistol. The short bow gets a buff to damage. Looks like about a 10% base damage increase. Its primary first attack is now called straight arrow instead of precise shot, and no longer has no dodge associated with it. That's a little sad. I really liked the no dodge on the short bow's primary attack. Power shot has had its range nerfed and its damage nerfed, but it also had inaccurate removed from it. So that's an interesting change. Make it a little less likely to miss, if nothing else, but it's not going to be pumping out those huge damage numbers that it used to. And then Rain of Arrows sees a 40%. 40% damage multiplier reduction. Although it doesn't look that bad in terms of the average damage numbers, but those look a little inaccurate because 0.2 or 0.4, I don't know. Rain of Arrows takes a nerf though. We're going to have to wait and see. It was one of those abilities that I think most consistently secured kills reliably, so it'll be interesting to see if now it's a little less reliable. The longbow, a very interesting set of changes kind of for the longbow. So the dodge buff is now going to scale off of level, which I think is interesting. So at level 5, it looks like you're going to be getting 50% dodge from it. It has a bit more range, which is, I guess, nice. And then explosive arrow gets a 10% stun increase. So overall, I guess the longbow not modified that much at all on second checking. The crossbow, though, getting some definite changes with a base damage increase. And then straight shot gets 4 uses per turn. Heavy bolt gets a bit more range. Impaling bolt becomes a 1 AP 2 mana attack, which I think is a fantastic change, although it's going to be doing a little less damage. And armor pierce now. And then explosive bolt is getting a little bit shaved off of its mana cost, 3 mana as opposed to the 4 that it previously was, and is going to be doing more damage. So overall, I think they generally felt that everything about the crossbow was underperforming, and they buffed it across the board. I think the crossbow is going to be in a really good place. It's giving me shortbow vibes a little bit. The rifle is getting a big damage increase. Its primary main attack that costs 2 AP is now going to be undodgeable. Hipshot is getting opportunism, which I think is very interesting. And assassinate is getting a reduction to the isolation multiplier from 2x to 1.5x. What I think is really interesting about this is, and don't quote me on this, but I believe the rifle now becomes the only weapon that has both opportunism and isolation. And what that means is that there's that one perk whose name I'm forgetting at the bottom of the range tree that gives you an increase to opportunism and isolation based off of 2 other stats. We'll see it a little later on, but it's now going to be pulling double duty if you're rocking a rifle. So that's interesting. Hipshot could become strong. I wouldn't mind seeing that becoming kind of like the rifle's defining ability. Offhand weapons. Oh my, how they have changed. So offhand weapons are now tied to the first skill of their main hand counterparts, with the exception of warp crystals. And those skills on offhand weapons now cost 0 AP and have 1 use per turn. I'm curious if this is increased by specialist. We're going to have to test that at some point, but it's very interesting that they are free and they are now the primary attack. So a magic orb offhand is now going to have 1 use of infect. But just to go through them really quickly, that means that the offhand dagger is doing backstab, the sword is doing slash, the axe is doing shred, the hammer is doing bash. Offhand axe, very exciting, very interesting. The offhand crossbow is doing quick shot, the pistol is doing pistol shot, the wand is doing Sword of Damocles with that new no dodge parameter, and then the scepter is doing magic bash. And then finally, the orb is doing infect. At a very high level, I think across the board, this is exciting. I think that the problem with offhand weapons previously was that they were always incredibly high mana cost, and now these are totally free. So it's going to be an interesting question of whether it is worth foregoing the block to get an extra backstab a turn. It's basically a little bit of extra economy, and you can almost think of these now as being like 1 extra AP and 1 extra headroom on your primary attack. And sometimes you can mix them in to very interesting effect. I could see a sword momentum build with an offhand scepter for that big momentum hit at the end being really interesting. Then other changes to items. Speaking of those shields and their block, we're going to have a lot more block on shields than we previously did. Brace, Fortify, and Evasion, those are the body armor skills, are now going to only be usable 1 time per turn, likely at a cost of 1 action point, but with significantly higher returns. So I think basically they're trying to make them more alluring and more effective. As for trinkets, the only real change that they list here is Meteor Ring is getting a big buff to base damage. It's getting cheaper from an AP perspective, cheaper from a mana perspective. It's having its range slightly nerfed, and it's being given vision. I don't think this is enough. I think that if they had removed the AP cost altogether and just made it cost 8 mana, maybe we'd be talking. But we'll have to see. Maybe Meteor Ring is a sleeper amazing item now. As for potions, all potions can now be thrown 3 tiles. I think that's very cool, and it's affected by skill range. I think that's very exciting. I should have highlighted that in blue. The potion of health now is combined with the potion of dispelling, so it will dispel all negative effects, and it will have the amount that is restoring appropriate with the current setup. Dispel potion no longer exists, and potion of stability grants immunity, previously only given by Twisted and a certain other enemy in Glenwall. And it will last up to 2 turns at higher levels, so no fear of bulkies stunning you with a portion of stability on your hands. Also, all restoration potions have been rebalanced. We'll have to wait and see. And defensive potions are now stronger, so you'll be getting more block from a stone skin potion. Who knows how much? It would need to be a lot for me to use a stone skin potion. Scrolls are now, mana costs are now scaling dependent on their level, making them cheaper than before at lower levels. This is very interesting, but basically what it means is like a low level scroll is going to be cheaper than its weapon counterpart, presumably. And they've also added a bunch of new scrolls: Axe Boomerang, Poison Daggers, Charge, Super Spin, Grape Shot, Assassinate, Magic Missile, Hammer of Faith, and Beasting. And there will no longer be a scroll of Scorching Wave, which I am very sorry to see, because I believe Scorching Wave is the opportunism ability on the power staff, although it might be the triangular fire ability. But anyways, both of those were present in scroll form, and I presume only one of them is anymore. And I hope it's the opportunism one, but we'll have to wait and see, because I can't remember off the top of my head. On to perks. Lots of changes to perks, so we'll work through them quickly. First and foremost, Spiky Counter gets a big upgrade all the way up to 50 base damage and added a -20 dodge malice. I presume that's because the Spiky Counter could be dodged, so now it's harder to dodge. Organic armor gets a better conversion rate on your armor to hit points, making it a little easier to stack a bunch of hit points. Mana growth is much more generous on the base mana and also more generous on the per level, trying to make it rival Harvester, but likely to still struggle a bit in that regard. And then Mana Collector sees a big nerf in the form of each crit only giving 1 mana and maxing out at 10 mana per turn. I think that's still probably always worth taking, but worth noting that it's a lot worse than it used to be. Shorter Weapons has its reliability bonus increased and the dodge bonus removed. Longer Weapons now has a -25 to reliability. I think it's still worth it. Skill range is still among the best. Proximity Shot gets a huge buff up to 40 with a larger decrement each tile away that you are. Proximity Shot could be interesting. We'll have to wait and see on that one. Exploit Weakness was the ability that I was trying to remember before, and it has had things changed pretty radically. So now your accuracy is going to increase your isolation, and your resistance reduction is going to translate into opportunism. I see this as a nerf because I think accuracy is something you always take. Resistance reduction is not something you always take. So having resistance reduction translate into opportunism means you're getting less kind of free opportunism off of exploit weakness. That's the way I look at it. It's very good news for anyone rolling isolation, though. Poisonous does a little more poison damage. Human Ballista has a very sneaky nerf. I really like this one. I think it's very clever, and I hate it. Human Ballista will no longer hit enemies that are directly next to you. The beauty, from my perspective, of Human Ballista historically was that it hit really hard, and if you had small cannon fodder enemies that walked up to you, they would die, so they wouldn't hit you. Now, it will never hit enemies that are directly adjacent to you, and as a result, it is much less defensive. It's still good for wave clear, still going to chunk down enemies and that sort of thing, but it will not be as protective to your more glassy heroes. Potion Throw now allows you to throw potions really, really far, up to 15. We assume that this includes the ability for range scaling, but we'll have to wait and see. And then Runic Gift now has even more bonus mana for the levels of your trinkets. I thought Runic Gift was already exceptional and I never paid attention to the bonus mana, so this is only good news. Harvester gets its second nerf during the existence of the game. It is still every 4 enemies killed, but now it is +1 daily mana regen up to 25% of the hero's mana. Sad, but understandable. And then Relentless gets a rework that I think is a little confusing. I'm just going to read the after. Whenever a hero has 3 or less current movement points and attacks in melee range, restore 1 movement, increased by 1 if the hero kills at least 1 target. So what this means is basically you get a maximum of 2 movement back, but only if you secure the kill. That's the short version of it. And previously, it just gave you the 2 movement. So minor nerf to Relentless, from my perspective. 1x1 has a very cool new mechanic, where previously you would lose your entire bonus the first time you attacked a non-isolated enemy. Now it's just going to increment and decrement the chance or the increase in damage. So basically, if you hit a non-isolated unit, it will reduce this bonus by 6% with a bottoming out at 0% and maxing out at 60%. I think this is huge for 1x1. It makes it much more attractive. It means that if you can, on average, be killing more isolated units than not, you will be stacking up damage. Then on to Blood Magic, which did not get my cool little orange chevrons, but we'll try and press forward anyways. So Blood Magic is remaining a 4x cost of health. So you take the mana cost, you multiply it by 4, and that's the cost. And then all of the hero's mana is transformed into resistance at a rate of 30%, and daily mana regen into health regen at 100%. Interesting. And then the big change is that from now on, when your hero unlocks the blood magic perk, some mana related perks will now be replaced with health related perks with the equivalent effects. So Harvester, Magic Fuel, Critical Runes, Thrifty, Energize, Explosive Essence, Mana Collector, and Mana Shield all will become blood/health-based options, which I think is very interesting. We're going to have to look at all of those, but it basically means that they've basically added a bunch of perks that take all of the irrelevant perks that didn't work for a blood mage and made them so they work now. It's very cool. It's a very neat idea. I'm excited to see how it all works. Next up, we have Inertia. Inertia also gets hit with the Nerf Bat, to no one's surprise. Now, where previously every time you used a momentum ability, it would give you 2 movement, now you need to travel 3 tiles before you are eligible to get the movement refund. So you will always be losing movement with Inertia. I think with Relentless and Inertia combined, you can get just above the break even, but you're never going to be generating and refilling your movement quite the way you did historically. We'll miss you. And then Mana Shield is being changed from the previous kind of confusing way that it had like an X in it and stuff like that. I'm just going to talk about the new way, which is basically every 2 mana you spend is going to increase your block by 3. So if you're spending a lot of mana, you can generate a lot of block with Mana Shield, and it's going to be a lot cleaner to figure out how much block you're generating. Now on to Omen changes. There are a lot. Most of them are pretty straightforward. Omen of Supplies, Wealth, Vitality, Rejuvenation, and Wisdom are all just getting a straight buff. Mysticism, same deal. Omen of Advanced Training is getting a buff in the sense that it's going to take up only 2 slots. I think that's a new sleeper. I think at 3 it was a little too expensive, but at 2 it's very nice. Omen of Second Chances getting reduced to a single slot, also very exciting. I think that one's one that I'm going to think a lot more about in the future. And then Omen of Restraint and Omen of Boxing being cheaper, I think just makes sense. Omen of the Wanderer is more expensive. I think that is very sensible and not surprising. And then Omen of Opportunities is more expensive now. I think they recognize that opportunism is very good and they are nerfing it accordingly. Omen of the Vulture is now 4 gold and 9 materials for each corpse that that rots. I think it's still probably not worth it, but it was embarrassingly bad before. Omen of the Outpost is giving wooden walls 20% more health, which is good. And then Omen of Fortification is improving that even further. So Omen of Fortification is basically Omen of Outpost plus 20% to stone walls as well. Then Omen of the Fortress is the final form of that. And it is going to be increasing stone walls all the way up to 40 and wooden walls all the way up by 60. So that's pretty substantial. I've never found walls to be that effective, but take that for what you will. And then Omen of Sturdiness is getting its block nerfed. Kind of surprised there. Omen of Steel is having a nice increase in armor. And then Omen of Craftsmanship is going down to a single slot cost. I think that one might be another one. I believe that Omen of Craftsmanship is the one that allows you to have 2 more production buildings. On to the buildings. The production buildings are all having their first production upgrade made more expensive and the second one removed, which is an interesting change up. I don't think that's going to be too crazy, but we'll have to wait and see how that kind of plays out. And then Help, which is the worker upgrade, is seeing its gold cost increased by net 20 over the course of an entire run to get it fully upgraded. And then a lot of that is being recouped in the item level upgrades, which are being made cheaper by a significant amount, by 30 and 60 respectively on the plus and the plus plus. So I think overall, I don't know how I feel about production plus plus getting removed, but it's going to be interesting. And I think overall, this is a net decrease in the cost of getting your production buildings fully upgraded. So that's probably for the best. As for utility buildings, Gift, which is the third action on the mana wall, the one that increases max mana, is getting a buff across the board. And then all defenses can now be placed adjacent to buildings. So I think we're going to have a little bit more space to work with within the town. And warp gates were made 20 materials cheaper at a cost of 60. I think that's a big one that we'll have to wait and see about. Now for the maps and enemies. First of all, you can look at the abilities of bosses now, which I think is kind of cool. Previously, you couldn't highlight them and look at them. And also there's a little bit of a dialogue phase when bosses show up, apparently. So we'll have to check those out eventually as well. Most of these changes are pretty non-consequential, so I'm not going to pay too much attention to them, but they've done a lot of night balancing on just because of the weapon changes. They need to kind of adjust things like Lakeburg Night 11, changes to the boss. I suspect that most of these changes are slight nerfs to make up for the fact that I think people were winning by, say, blowing up bosses with momentum, and they're not going to be doing that anymore. Big news for Lakeburg, though. The large gates to the lower right-hand side of the base can now be repaired or destroyed. That's very good news because they added a lot of cool ambiance to the fortress, and I hated having to tear them down when they got low on HP. Same thing with Glenwall. It'll be very interesting, but I suspect we're going to see the bosses are going to be a little squishier and a little easier to kill. And some of the waves are going to be stronger. Some of the waves are going to be slightly larger. Elderlicht, I was really, really, really hoping to see them further forecasting the location of the lit braziers, but it doesn't look like that's happening. And instead, they are going to be buffing some of the waves and adjusting the bosses accordingly. And they also apparently have rebalanced the soulbound enemies, but we're going to have to wait and see what those look like when we get there again. On to the miscellaneous, and I'm not going to go through all of this because this video is already long, but corpses have some changes that I think are interesting, or we'll have to wait and see. So corpses have been tweaked to appear more often during early nights. Yay. Awesome to have more corpses available while being more controlled in numbers on the later nights. So we can expect more corpses early and then probably less corpses long term. The corpse generation's internal rules have been modified to feel more cohesive and granular. This is very cryptic, but one thing that they say is that elite carry-on and elite variations of corpses are going to be changing. I wonder if that means that you no longer get an elite corpse guaranteed when an elite is inside of your base. We're going to have to wait and see. And then corpses can no longer spawn inside the mist. I don't know when this was happening, but I'm curious how that will work. They made a bunch of overhauls to sound effects. I'm not going to go through all of them, but good news, hero deaths are now going to have a new sound effect. So let's hope we don't hear it anytime soon. They did a lot of things with boss sounds, ambient sounds for the game. I think it's going to sound like a whole new game. Excited to see that. Many bug fixes, but I've pulled out a few in blue here that I was particularly excited about. One is reloading a run no longer messes with the guess where arrows. I ran into that a couple of times. And then rippers are no longer going to be eating your elite enemies. Fantastic news on that front. We lost a couple of good elites to rippers in the early game, and it was very frustrating. The perk resupply now works correctly. That means that we can go back to testing out trap style builds, which I'm very excited about. And then on a very, very sad note, bounty hunters no longer attack mist sensors with their charged attacks. This was previously very useful. I'm very curious to see if the same is true of the Glenwall bosses' walls, which were previously also being attacked by bounty hunters. The list goes on. A lot of changes and updates to how controllers work and making controllers work that, you know, we'll see throughout the fixes. This page is nothing but controller updates. And then the controller updates and D-pad changes continue in here. But that right there is the last spell 1.0. So if this tickles your fancy, if you're excited to see what Glintfine has to offer, shortly after this video goes live tomorrow, or maybe when this video goes live tomorrow, I will also be live on my channel playing the new update, and I would love to see you there. If this guide was helpful to you, if you liked the style of it, you are interested in more content like this, such as the guides that I'm putting out for beginners to the last spells, please hit the subscribe button, because we have a few more guides coming, and we have a few guides already put out that explain some portions of the game that I think were not super modified by this set of changes. But for now, that does it for me. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I hope to see you around on stream sometime. But for now, take it easy. I'll see you in the next one.